From our offices in Boston, Massachusetts, and New Orleans, Louisiana, this is Design of Play. I'm still the guy in the booth, oh god, why hasn't someone sent help? Ito Davis, with your host, Chris Canfield. Today's episode, well, I'll let you find out.
Dear independent gamers, you've spent years asking for a story-driven game with little mechanics to get in the way of narrative. You want a female-centric title, both with core female characters and for female players, though still enjoyable by men. And you want this to be a huge public hit. I've got the game you've been asking for. It's the Kim Kardashian Hollywood iPhone game. Now, put the pitchforks down and hear me out. It's story-driven. There's no action other than what's happening in the narrative. It's female-centric and would easily pass the Bechdel test. Women talk to women about things other than men all the time. You know, like getting runway gigs and taking selfies. It's a gigantic mainstream hit, drawing in over $43 million in its first 3 months of release. It is the interactive fiction mega hit you've been clamoring for since Zork. It's also a good excuse to take a quick review of where interactive fiction stands today. So, what is interactive fiction?
To me, interactive fiction is about the experience of a player having direct interaction with the narrative.
That's Carolyn VanEseltine, professional game designer, award-winning author, and interactive fiction writer.
So that their choices are being taken very much into effect, either on a moment-by-moment basis, like in parser games, like Zork and Colossal Cave Adventure, or on more of a larger scene-by-scene, decision-by-decision base, and that's what you see more in Twine. But it's also something that can be incorporated into a larger narrative, as we've seen in many big-budget titles.
A quick note, we'll use the terms interactive fiction, story games, and narrative-focused games interchangeably here. So, the first text adventure was actually made in 1975. It was called Advent, short for adventure. The computer at the time could only handle file names with 6 characters in it. Will Crowther wrote this in his spare time as a way of connecting with his children after a divorce. Now, it's not that Will Crowther was eschewing graphics because they wanted to be independent, or be closer to novels, or be hipsters before it was cool. It was that computers at the time were mostly lines of text. You'd type things into a computer, and it would type back. Graphics were difficult and poorly supported. There was no OpenGL or the like. So when Will Crowther wrote Advent, he was using the easiest tool at the time available to him. Now, there's no record whether the little Crowthers loved the game very much, but Advent got around on the early version of the internet and garnered a lot of attention from college students who probably should have been working on something else. This was seen by a few students at MIT, Mark Blank and Dave LeBling, who decided to create their own game. This became the aforementioned Zork, a title so popular that Gamasutra refers to it as the Iliad of text adventures. It's mentioned as a favorite game of Big Bang Theory's Sheldon Cooper, Arrow's Felicity, and Chuck's Chuck. Mark and Dave formed Infocom, which went on to release many more Zork games, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game, the Planetfall series, and many, many, many others. In December 1983, Infocom, and therefore the interactive fiction world, had 10 of the top-selling 40 PC games. That's like relative unknown Charlie Bell bursting onto the Austin music scene, but instead of having one-hit records, she has 25% of them all at once. These weren't all sword and sorcery adventures. A Mind Forever Voyaging was a Steve Maretsky game for Infocom that was a serious adventure as a critique of 1980s Ronald Reagan politics. It includes overstimulation suicide booths, hand-sized nuclear bombs, industrial pollution, and a police state of the United States of North America. As a critique of the political politics of the day, it was a bold move. And it managed to be a major critical success with a message not lost on the population. And it sold tremendously well. Actually, that's not true. It was a bit of a bomb. Maretsky was annoyed that his intelligent critique of popular culture failed to drum up controversy, so the next game he created was the sex farce game, The Leather Goddess of Phobos. And that, of course, flew off shelves. Fans. But eventually graphics began eating into the text adventure genre's popularity, and by the mid-90s, commercial text adventures were a near standstill. It's arguable whether or not CD adventure games like Myst and The Seventh Guest count as interactive fiction, but they're clearly not text adventures. Still, this time had an exciting burst of independent interactive fiction. 1993 saw the first release of Inform, a free programming environment where people could, and still do, make independent text adventures. This, along with TADS, the simply named Text Adventure Development System, formed a backbone of the interactive fiction movement. It stopped being driven by the commercial world and became driven by an independent artistic movement. This creative community thrived on the Usenet. If you don't know what the Usenet is, it's like BitTorrent for your grandparents, except it's hard to use and with less lawsuits.
In that period of time, I think there's a lot more awareness of the fact that this is an artistic medium, that we can tell stories where violence isn't at the core. Which isn't to say that we can't tell stories about violence as well, but I think that games as a medium are moving much more into embracing the entire human experience, and I think that's wonderful.
The interactive fiction movement remains strong to this day. This includes large games such as Shade by Andrew Plotkin, and smaller titles like Rainbows and Dance Parties by Carolyn VanEseltine. So if there's not money in it, why is there still such a creator culture around text adventure games?
I think part of what makes it so compelling is that you don't need the big budget. You don't need 40 people behind you or 400 people behind you. If you have an inspiration and your experience with interactive fiction, the game you cited earlier, Rainbows and Dance Parties, was literally made in 14 hours. I know, I timed it. It was made from that moment of discovery to I have an inspiration to, at the end of the day, okay, here is a thing I made, it has come out that fast, anybody can experience it now. I think it's extremely important for games to have awareness of the context in which they're created. I think that one of the largest problems with AAA studios is that so many of them have a lack of awareness of the world in which they're being created. They have this outdated concept of who their audience is and what they want, and they cling to that without being aware of what today is and the things that are going on in the world around them. The faster you can move, the faster you can create a game, the more chance you have to talk about the things that matter to you in the moment when everyone else is aware of them.
Why make an interactive fiction game? Why not make a book or a movie or, dare I say it, a podcast?
It's because of the direct player interaction, or the direct reader interaction, I suppose you could say. Even though you've tried to think out all the options that they could be taking, and you might have a correct path in mind, that doesn't mean that they aren't bringing something to the table as well. One example I'm going to call out here is by a recent Twine author, Porpentine. There's a game called With Those We Love Alive. If you search for With Those We Love Alive on Twitter, what you're going to come back with is all these drawings that people did in Sharpie on their arms. And the reason why is because Porpentine in that game really challenged people to make it their own. There are instructions as you go through the game, moments when you're asked to draw interpretive art, possibly on a piece of paper, but almost everybody I've seen did it on their arms and in a way that they had to keep for 2 days or a week or however long it takes Sharpie to rub off them. And that was something that really spoke to me, that idea of it's not just one person producing and one person consuming, it's a collaborative experience.
So now we live in a world where a lot of game development funding is happening for phones, and the phone changes everything. How do we do story-based phone games on a tiny screen better?
Phone screens are smaller. Like, that sounds silly when I say it, but the experience of scrolling through text on a phone is really quite terrible. There's a saying that players don't like to read, which probably sounds funny coming from someone who mainly works on interactive fiction, but it's very true. You need to ensure that whatever story you're telling is told in a very tight, clean fashion. This is even more important for mobile gaming because the chance that someone can sit there for your half-hour-long cutscene is 0. So if you're working for mobile, if you're working on a phone, yeah, you want things to be easily paused, you want to minimize scrolling, you want to make sure that the UI elements and the system for the story that you're telling are things that are not going to look great on your computer screen and terrible on your phone. So there are people who, Andrew Plotkin comes to mind again. This time I'm thinking of his game Hadean Lands, which was released last year to great acclaim. And he did release it for iPhone, but the experience of typing on an iPhone is extraordinarily different than the experience of typing on a computer. iPhones just aren't very friendly to the interface of now I want you to type 4 words in, and some of them are going to be over 10 letters long. This is terrible. He did find some very intelligent ways around that, drop-down menus and other systems to ensure that you were not sitting there hunting and pecking across letters for eons. But that's a very real limitation. Twine games and other choice-based games are much better adapted to that.
It occurs to me that my master's degree thesis would have worked pretty well here. It was a text-only game where you interacted with a suicidal character. You talked them through natural language typing, trying to figure out what was troubling them. If you connected with them emotionally, they tended to stay longer and stay chatting with you. If you didn't connect with them, they left. And what followed was left to the imagination of the players. But the core of the gameplay was the simple call-and-response text interaction, which could have easily happened while texting over a phone. And like many interactive fiction games, it was an intensely personal title that had strong meaning to me and to the other players. So emotionally resonant pieces of art are wonderful, but they don't feed my cats. How do we make financially successful interactive fiction games?
I hate to say it, but a commercially successful interactive fiction title is going to be very related to what budget there was to forward it. Either that, or it's going to be the kind of gamble you got with Flappy Birds. That happens just as much with interactive fiction titles as it does with other titles. You make something good, and then either you throw a budget behind marketing, which you certainly don't get as much in an indie scene, in a solo scene, or you make something that's so innovative that people can't turn their backs on it, no matter what it was that you did. Porpentine comes to mind immediately. There's no one who writes like Porpentine. I don't necessarily like what she does, but I can't deny that you play one of her games, it is one of her games. Nobody else knows how to do that.
Which is to say, the economics of interactive fiction games are very similar to regular games, just on a smaller scale. Gone Home, an amazing niche story game about how growing up and realizing you don't fit how your parents see the world, sold 250,000 copies. In a world where 1 million sold or less is considered a commercial failure, 250,000 seems small. But the team was only 4 people, and 250,000 sales was more than enough to be a complete success for such a small studio. They have since grown and released more titles. As a side note, some of the interactive fiction movement lived on in multi-user dungeons, or MUDs. These are interactive text-only environments similar to Zork, but with many players yelling at each other at once. When they became MOOs, MUD Object-Oriented, yeah, the acronym is atrocious, just let them have this one. But when they become object-oriented, it allowed many players to author sections of the world collaboratively. Author, deface, same thing. This evolved directly into massively multiplayer online role-playing games like EverQuest and World of Warcraft. And those, of course, are gigantic successes. And so while interactive fiction has a reputation for being the financially poor part of the gaming world, it actually is responsible for one of the most financially profitable. So when you're shouting that your healer just went AFK as the rag turns you into dead elf pudding, you can thank literature. There's a lot more creative freedom that comes along with smaller, more accessible budgets. What would you like to see in games in the future?
This will not surprise you. More characters who look like me. And by looking like me, I mean characters who may be female, characters who may be LGBTQ. There are so many other things, and I'm not just talking about me, but everybody who looks at a game and wants to see themselves and their lived experience and has a very hard time finding it. There are stereotypes associated with so many minorities that cause game developers to think we shouldn't have a black protagonist, we shouldn't have an Asian protagonist unless they know Kung Fu, we shouldn't have a disabled protagonist because how could that be an interesting game? These things are not true. These things are blinders, and we really need to move past that.
How do you feel about games that default to a white male protagonist, but sell additional minority characters?
It's offensive. It's just out and out offensive. It's not acceptable. It is telling your audience so clearly, we thought you might be playing our games, but we're not aiming this at you. You are an add-on. You are an other. That's horrifying. That is not what this industry should be doing, and I would think less of a developer who did that.
So back to the Kim Kardashian game. It ticks all the boxes you'd expect from a piece of modern mass-market media. It has a major headlining star. It is a Hollywood fantasy that makes my inner Morrissey squee. You get to wine and dine cute dates, buy new clothing, do some runway modeling, and set the fashion world on fire. It's also all based around freemium time-based energy mechanics. Hammer the pose button and do better on the runway. Hammer the flirt button and flirt with a co-star. These take energy, run out of energy, and wait until tomorrow to do it all again. And there aren't a lot of choices. And those choices aren't exactly socially positive. They're mostly about what clothes to buy and who to date. This is about as culturally regressive as a female-empowered, broadly playable interactive fiction game starring a half-Armenian businesswoman can be. But it does show the way ahead. Narrative fiction isn't incompatible with modern phones, freemium monetization, or, well, the modern world. The Kim Kardashian game, sadly enough, proves that. And like that trailblazer, we just need to find ways to connect human stories, reasonable budgets, and specific target markets. And if Kim Kardashian isn't your bag, and I don't hold that against you if it is, there are a surprising amount of interactive fiction options on the iPhone. Might I recommend starting with 80 Days, a branching narrative game about, you guessed it, being exceedingly British and taking caravanning just a little bit too far. 80 Days was named Time Magazine's Game of the Year for 2014, not their interactive fiction phone Game of the Year, but their Game of the Year across all games. Hopefully this podcast is connected with the human story in you. Author us about it. You can reach us at Design of Play on Twitter, or me at Chris_Canfield on Twitter, or email me at chris@chriscanfield.net.
And you can drop me a line, the man in the booth, Edo Davis, at massalbatross, that's with one S, at gmail.com.
Also, if you can, leave a review for this podcast on iPhone, Android, or wherever you found it. We'd appreciate it. Today's podcast has been brought to you by the letter smiley face. Yes, according to Unicode, emoji are technically letters now. You may begin drinking. Additional consideration by starving artists who considered donating but were too starving. And of course, we do all of this for you, our listeners. This has been Design of Play. Thank you for...
I have a work in progress I would love to plug.
Sure. Go right ahead.
I'm actually under contract with a company called Choice of Games, and Choice of Games is creating interactive novels. They really are focused on making something that gives you the same experience as you'd have if you were, picking up a novel, except that you're participating in it. They very much share my ideals about treating women and minorities with respect, and so their titles tend very much to be ones where, yeah, if you want to play as a lesbian, you can play as a lesbian. There will be love interests available for you. If you want to play as a man, you can play as a man. If you want to be somebody who is not necessarily going to do the right thing, they make sure that there is just this very wide ability to go through their games in whatever way makes sense to you. I can't actually go into super detail about the game that I'm working on for them. And I can tell you that the fact that I'm working with them was inspired by one of their games called Choice of Robots by Kevin Gold. It is something that starts with the premise of you are building the first AI robot and becomes this entire meditation on war and death. It really opened my eyes to what could be done in a longer form.
Those are on phone and PC, by the way. If you want artistically valid games, support their creators. And by support, I mean give them money. This has been Design of Play. Thank you for playing.
Today's music was Space Rhythm 1 by Secret Circuit and Cruising by Benedict from the Free Music Archives, CC by 3.